heard that this was going to be happening since several months, and so I didn't know, because you were saying, maybe there will be 5 people, maybe there will be 500, but whatever it is, it's nice to talk about the ideas in kind of a more intimate surrounding. So I told you a little bit about my background. The thing is, my background was I started off as a research scientist, so my approach to things has this analytical aspect to it. So if you're faced with a problem, how do you going about it in a sort of logical way? And I think in a way, if we look at what's going on in the world, we see there's a lot of crap going on. Things are not necessarily going in the right direction. But if you want to see about how to change things, I think there are 2 basic questions. One is, what matters, and what do we actually want? And the other question is more of a procedural one. How do we actually get closer to what we want? So when I wrote my book, it took several years. It started off as a collection of notes and built up. What I was actually found myself addressing as a basic question is, what matters? It was an attempt to really understand, first of all, why are things going so badly in the world? Why is there so much conflict? Why is there so much suffering? And essentially, the fundamental question was, what really matters? Everyone seems to have different opinions about which way society should be going, what kinds of decisions we should make. And if you want to answer these questions, you ultimately want to have some basic feeling of what, in the large scheme of things, really matters, what should our underlying values be. And so writing the book was it was an attempt to answer that question in a very sort of methodical way. And then towards the end of the book, I proposed some suggestions, some answers for how we can move in that direction. So if you're trying to answer this question, what matters, it seems that the most obvious place to start is with our own experience, our own subjective experience. And that old quote from René Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." I like it because it's basically saying the starting point for understanding things is with ourselves, very factual. I am here. I am experiencing emotions, happiness and meaning and suffering and thoughts. And in the larger sense, whenever anything matters, when you think about it, it will ultimately come down to subjective experience. Everything that matters in the world matters because there's some sentient being that is experiencing it. So if the world were just composed of rocks and water and there was no life on it, it's hard to say that anything would matter because nobody would be around to experience it. Yeah? So that's kind of the starting point. When we think about things mattering, we have to think about what the effect is on someone's subjective experience, whether it's our own or that of others. And then the next question is, well, what really matters about subjective experience? What is it about mental states that matter? And we all search for happiness. We all search for meaning in our lives. And obviously that's a key part of what life is about. If there were no happiness, if there were no meaning, it wouldn't be worth living. But then you can look at the other end of the spectrum, which is suffering. And I would argue, and a lot of people that in my network have similar opinions, which is that suffering has an inherent urgency about it. And it's a sense of urgency that translates into priority. So what that means is that, if somebody's already happy, if they're already having a happy life, there's not any immediate need to make them even more happy. If they're content, if they don't feel like anything's wrong, sure, it would be nice to give them some more money, for them to go on vacation more often. But if they're basically happy, okay, it's like no major problem right here. As soon as somebody is suffering, there's some sort of intrinsic need for things to change. And it becomes all the worse when we're talking about intense suffering, So this is the key thing, that suffering, and especially intense suffering, have this urgency about it that creating more happiness doesn't have. Which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be creating happiness, but it means that if you look at everything that's going on in terms of the whole range of experiences that sentient beings are having, the ones that are suffering most intensely require the most attention because they can't wait. And so when you start to look at what kinds of suffering exist out there in the world, well, when you look at human suffering, there are all the consequences of the just of the kind of economic and political system that we live in. People living in poverty, people, mental health issues. It's kind of not as visible, but when people are suffering from deep depression, it has a huge impact on their lives, and it's a very sort of intense and especially chronic form of suffering. And then there are diseases that could be treated better, but just aren't because people aren't getting the proper medical care. And then there's the really sort of intense suffering that comes from from conflict and from terrorism and the things that we read about in the paper all the time. But also the way that criminals are treated, the way that people who haven't actually committed any crime against, where there's no victim, victimless crimes as they're called, are still put in prison. And even people who have committed crimes where there are victims, but they've done things because they were desperate. They're treated in inhumane ways, and that varies from country to country. But in general, our society is not treating people with a lot of compassion. Most part. And there's a lot of suffering that's going on that is preventable. That wouldn't even cost anything to prevent. It would just mean changing our priorities and changing the way things are organized. So I've been talking about humans, but if you accept the idea that suffering matters, and suffering is something that happens inside, it doesn't depend on what somebody looks like outside, it becomes obvious that animals matter as well. And we accept dogs. We introduce dogs and cats as members of our family. We show them love. We treat them sometimes better than we treat kids. And yet, other kinds of animals, for various reasons, that are just as intelligent as dogs, or feel emotions, feel pain, feel suffering, we put them into a different category, and we say, okay, this animal is part of the family, and this animal we turn into bacon. And not only do we convert it into food, but there's this huge industry of taking animals and hiding them away from our view, putting them in narrow cages where they spend their whole lives not being able to move, and it's massive. It's going on a huge scale, all over the world, and we're talking billions of animals. And I've seen so many videos of it. It's just there's so much cruelty, and it's funny because I wouldn't say it's funny, but I'm in a network where I have a lot of contact with animal rights activists, and so I can sometimes feel like I'm in my bubble, and I have the impression like everybody cares about these issues and it's really on the radar screen. But as soon as you get out of that bubble, you realize that there's a growing awareness now. People are becoming more conscious of what's going on, but it's still not really out there as much as it should be in terms of a priority. And it's not that I care more about animals than humans. All I'm saying here is that suffering matters for its own sake, and if there's a being that's suffering intensely, it doesn't matter whether it's a human or animal. That's something that needs to be addressed. So if you think about what this all means in terms of an ethical framework, we can go back to a very simple principle which has been around for thousands of years. It exists in many different cultures and religions, and it's known generally as the Golden Rule. And it's very simple. There are two different formulations of it. One is that do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's the negative way of expressing it, which is that which is harmful to you, do not do unto others. And people have been discussing ethics for hundreds, for thousands of years. But if we were to take this very basic principle and apply it consistently, our world would be totally different. The only things I would say that where we could tweak it so that it's really as universal as possible is, first of all, it applies not just to humans, but really to all sentient beings. And this is really about it spreading our circle of compassion to encompass all beings that have the capacity to suffer, including not only ones that are living today, but also to do what we can to ensure that those who come into being in the future also are spared suffering, so that they have the capacity to live in a happy way. So the idea is that it doesn't matter in space and time where a sentient being exists. It's just that every sentient being matters, and suffering matters wherever it occurs. The other things I would add on is that it's not just about being passive, about not doing harm, but it's about taking active steps to relieve suffering where we see it. And as I said before, intense suffering should logically have the highest priority. There's a way of looking at things that adds another dimension to this, which is this whole idea of identity. You know, we each think of ourselves as separate. You know, like I'm this one person, same identity throughout life, and I'm separate from you. And when you think about it, you realize that, well, it's not quite as straightforward, because we all change over time. Our identities change a little bit. You know, we have the same name, we look kind of the same over time, but you know, our personalities change a little bit. We have life experiences, we evolve, we react differently to situations. So, you know, in subtle and not so subtle ways, our identity actually does change over time. And perhaps even more importantly, the idea of us being distinct from another is also a bit of an illusion. You can just imagine that we're all, the way I like to put it, we're all variations on a theme. You know, it's like we have the same template, and we've just had different life experiences, and, you know, slight differences in our DNA. But basically, we're all the same kind of blueprint, and we've just gone off in different directions with different life experiences. But we all have the same needs to be happy and to avoid suffering. So when you look at it like that, all of a sudden this idea of the golden rule makes even more sense, because in a certain way, when you care about others, you're caring about some sort of variation of yourself. And just from a purely practical perspective, if we all were cooperative and altruistic towards each other, and we all got that back, we'd all be much happier than in this very competitive society that values separateness rather than togetherness. Yeah. So, you know, so with this basic ethical framework based on the golden rule and based on compassion, you know, we can imagine a vision for society where we steadily try to decrease suffering in the world. And so then the question is, how do we get to that kind of a society? So I guess a couple of the things that we can keep in mind are, well, first, what are the actual sources of suffering that we want to aim at? And I mentioned a few beforehand. So there's all the cruelty that's inflicted on animals. There's the need for proper health care so that everybody can have, you know, diseases treated and not suffer pain that could be avoided. Just to backtrack for a second, the starting point is still ourselves. So I would say the three things that we can each do individually. First of all, is to look after ourselves, because if we're not looking after ourselves, we're not going to be very effective at looking after others either. It's a starting point for everything. If you're an activist and you're putting all your energy out into the world and you're not looking after your own well-being, you're going to burn out. So we need to be compassionate with ourselves and look after our own suffering and learn to be grounded and you know, not take all the burden of the world onto our shoulders. That's the first thing. The second thing is to see how we can live without causing too much harm, causing as little harm as possible. And one of the ways I think we can do that is to look especially at our eating habits, because especially when we're eating, you know, eating the products of animals that have been tortured, I mean, there's a connection. So if we're willing to look at that connection, then we can start to say, well, is there a way that I can change how I'm eating? Whether it's going vegan, whether it's reducing consumption, at the very least, you know, making sure that we're sourcing our food better. But you know, my feeling is that the more we can get away from eating animals, and the more we can find a healthy way of eating that's plant-based, we end up benefiting ourselves as well. with a little bit of attention to what we eat, making sure that your diet is balanced, you can actually live a very healthy, probably healthier diet than one that's animal-based. And we also know the impact on the environment. And the third thing that we can do is to try to support new initiatives that are aimed at a gentler society. And the kinds of initiatives I'm thinking of are ways of actually embedding compassionate ethics into our systems, whether it's the political decision-making systems that we have, so that they're closer to people's needs and have ethics embedded in them. The economic system, so that we have a more equitable distribution of resources, so that we don't just have this increasing inequality. So as Pete was mentioning before, we're hearing more and more talk about a universal basic income, so that basically everybody is assured that they're not going to fall off the edge. And there are very good reasons for it, very good economic reasons for it, and lots of other reasons. It would take a lot of the fear out of people's lives and allow people to lead more meaningful lives. And there are other benefits. There are some arguments why things that we need to be careful about in how it's implemented, but it's being tested out in different countries, and I think this would go a long way to reducing suffering, especially human suffering. And it could also be linked to reducing animal suffering. There are ways of giving people ethical vouchers so that they can use the food for more ethical products. So these are some of the ideas that we can implement. Obviously we should not be imprisoning people for victimless crimes. We should be envisioning a justice system that is more based on the Nordic examples, the Nordic systems like Finland and Norway, that even people that have committed crimes are treated with respect. They're given a sense of responsibility, so that when they leave prison, they're not a danger. They're much less of a danger to society than in other systems. It's a whole different approach. And one of the things I talk about in my book is the fact that we all need to take responsibility for our actions and for the future. And at the same time, things just happen. Things happened in the past, and we can't control the past. So by pointing fingers at people and institutions, by blaming them, we may be letting off steam, but it's not productive.
Yeah.
And it's a very ingrained mindset, this idea of blaming. Yeah. But when we can get away with that, we can start to look at solutions. It's like, okay, we can't change the past, but what kinds of actions will lead us to a better future? And I think that will transform human relations. It's not easy, but if we can do that, in our own lives and in the way that we carry out activism, I think we'll be more effective. And maybe just one more point I wanted to make, and this is linked to what I just said, is that we need to respect human nature. So the way we carry out activism needs to be mindful of basic human needs. And I think two of the most basic needs are to be cared for. People have basic needs for food, for lodging, for basic material needs to be looked after. And we can't expect people to give up their basic needs for others. Nobody wants to be a martyr for the planet if their own needs are not taken care of. So even though we may ask people to sacrifice a little bit when it comes to a more equal distribution of wealth, we still need to respect that people want their basic needs looked after, and we need to respect that. And the other thing, which is related, is that people have a strong sense of identity, which is attached to their group, to their tribe. And people, we see that in politics today, that even when you start giving people arguments about why their view is wrong, they sometimes dig their heels more into the ground because they don't want to have their identity threatened. Their identity is their tribe, and it's just a fact of human nature. Some people are open to facts, but when it threatens them, they're more likely to they might even feel more strongly about what they felt beforehand. So even though it's our instinct very often to dig our heels in, everybody's digging their heels in and throwing mud back and forth and getting more and more polarized. If we're really looking for a society that's more inclusive, we need to find ways of bringing people back together. So we need to respect people's identity. We need to listen to them. Listening, I think, is key. And once we've listened and shown respect, we can open them up to hearing other facts. But people don't change their minds necessarily overnight, and we need to take a gentler approach and a more inclusive approach if we want to spread compassion more effectively. There's one other point I realized I didn't make, which is that I think there's a huge potential, at least, to spread compassion among children. And I think in a lot of schools, children are taught a lot of things which are not necessarily very useful. And one of the most important things they should learn is to be compassionate to themselves and to others. And so what I mentioned earlier during the introduction is I set up a little think tank last year called Opus. So the whole idea is to promote compassion and to prioritize the prevention of suffering in the world, through various kinds of projects. And one of them is to to design and prepare and spread a toolkit for educators, so that educators, teachers, and school boards can have guidance on how to bring compassion into the schoolroom through exercises, through real hands-on practice. And other things we want to do are to actually prepare concrete blueprints on what compassion means in practice in terms of policy proposals, and promote those to other think tanks and to political parties, and get these ideas actually get people to start looking at them, and more, most importantly, to promote the whole idea of compassion as a basis for how everything works.